When you think about the concept of home, there is this immediate, like almost instinctual expectation of sanctuary.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Like, picture it for a second. You walk through your front door after a really grueling day, you slide that deadbolt into place, and the chaos of the outside world just, it just stops.
It's a very comforting boundary to imagine.
It really is. The lock is physical, obviously, but it's also psychological. It's a binary state. You are safe inside, and the government, the state, the sheer noise of society, all of that remains firmly on the outside.
Yeah, and fundamentally, we rely on that imagined boundary to just, well, to function in our day-to-day lives.
Right.
We operate under the assumption that the family unit is a sovereign territory,
right,
basically, a private space where we get to set the rules.
But then you start looking at the actual sociological data, specifically focusing on marginalized communities in North America.
Right, and that changes everything.
It really does. You realize that deadbolt is, well, it's mostly decorative. The structural landscape reveals that the state has basically always held a master key to that front door.
A master key they use quite often.
Exactly. And the ways they choose to use that key are incredibly invasive.
Yeah, when you begin to examine the mechanics of how institutions actually interact with the family unit, that illusion of the impenetrable sanctuary shatters.
Completely shatters.
You start to see that the boundaries of the home are completely permeable if the state decides you don't fit the dominant cultural mold.
Which brings us right to the core of what we are doing today. Welcome to this deep dive into a profoundly important curriculum called The Social Fabric Unraveled, which was created and produced by Adam.
It's a fantastic curriculum.
It really is. Our mission for you today is to unpack the profound and honestly often entirely invisible intersections of race, immigration, and state-sponsored violence within North American family life.
There is a lot to cover.
So much. We are going to trace the historical roots of family separation, looking really closely at colonial assimilation tactics, and figure out the mechanisms connecting those historical events to their modern-day legal equivalents.
And to do that, we are drawing from a really robust stack of source materials today.
Let's lay those out.
Yeah, so we are utilizing the audio lectures of sociologist Dr. Elisa Newman to provide the theoretical framing. We're also pulling from the academic research of Jean Lafrance and Don Collins, who analyzed the devastation of Aboriginal parenting.
Right. And we're also looking at Krista McCracken's work on the weaponization of archival photography.
That part is fascinating.
It's incredible. Plus, we have some incredibly heavy data from the Leddy Library on the missing children of Canada.
Yeah.
And to bring this right up to the present moment, we are examining a harrowing CBC News investigative report on modern birth alerts.
A lot of material.
It is. So if you are listening to this right now, just know we are covering a massive amount of ground today. And some of it is going to really challenge how you view the legal structures around you.
Yeah, to really grasp the disparities we see in family stability today, we have to start by kind of expanding our definition of violence.
Okay, expand on that.
Well, when we hear state-sponsored violence, we typically picture, police action or military intervention.
Right, guys in riot gear.
Exactly. But throughout North American history, the most effective tools for enforcing cultural norms have actually been structural violence and symbolic violence.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm following the distinction there because those terms can sound a bit like academic jargon.
Fair enough.
Let me try to break that down. Structural violence is when the harm is baked right into the legal and political system, right? Like the law itself does the damage.
That is a really good way to frame it. Structural violence isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature.
A feature.
Yeah. It is the literal application of state power to disrupt a life or a family completely legally.
Wow.
Symbolic violence, on the other hand, is the omnipresent psychological weight of that system.
The threat of it.
Exactly. It is the constant looming threat that the state could ruin your life at any moment, which, forces you to change your behavior out of sheer fear.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. And to really understand how those mechanisms work, I think we have to look at one of the most overt historical examples of structural violence in North America.
The Canadian Indian residential school system.
Yes. This was a massive state-sponsored infrastructure that operated from 1831 all the way until 1998.
That timeline is just...
I know, we'll let that timeline sink in for a second. 1998.
It's so recent.
People listening to this right now are probably watching Seinfeld and dialing up to the internet while these schools were still legally operating.
That really puts it in perspective.
And over that time, at least 150,000 First Nations, Inuit and Metis children were forcibly separated from their families.
The scale is just immense, and the mechanism for this separation wasn't accidental. It was a highly calculated policy. The stated goal of the government, which, worked in tandem with various religious organizations, was the total assimilation of indigenous peoples into the dominant Euro-Canadian society.
Total assimilation.
Yeah. And the state determined that the absolute most efficient way to achieve assimilation was to sever the generational tie.
So instead of trying to change the adults, you just take the kids.
You extract the children, you place them in institutions that are intentionally located hundreds of miles away from their homes to prevent visitation.
God.
You strictly forbid them from speaking their native languages, and you rigorously punish any practice of their culture.
Wow.
You essentially starve the culture of its next generation.
It's the literal extraction of a child from their cultural ecosystem. But, if you were a member of the general public during the decades this was happening, you probably wouldn't have viewed it as a violent extraction.
No, you wouldn't have.
In fact, you might have thought it was a benevolent charity project. And that is entirely because of how the state weaponized photography.
This is where Krista McCracken's analysis becomes so crucial to understanding the era.
Tell us about that.
So, McCracken looked deeply into the archival photography from the Spanish Indian residential schools in Ontario, specifically the Garnier, St. Joseph, and St. Peter Claver schools.
Okay.
They analyzed the Reverend Father William Maurice Fawn's, which is this archive containing over 1,500 photographs.
And when you look at these images, they are chilling in how aggressively normal they look.
Very curated.
Yeah. If you pull up these archives, you see young boys playing football. You see them playing hockey.
Looking like any other school.
Right. They are dressed in these immaculate, standardized athletic uniforms. They are standing in neat, highly organized rows. They look muscular. They look healthy. And they're smiling directly at the camera.
They project an image of absolute thriving vitality. But McCracken asks us to look at the power dynamics of the archive itself.
The power of the lens.
Exactly. A photograph is never just an objective recording of a moment, especially in an institutional setting. The person holding the camera holds the power to dictate reality. In this case, the photographer was almost always an Indian agent, a missionary, or a school official.
So they are essentially setting the stage. I want to throw an analogy out there just to see if this tracks for you.
Go for it.
Imagine a massive multinational corporation today gets caught in a horrific human rights scandal or like a devastating environmental disaster. What do they do?
Damage control.
Exactly. They hire a high-priced PR firm, and suddenly their social media feeds are flooded with highly curated, beautifully lit photos of their executives planting trees or smiling employees doing charity work.
Burying the story.
It's a deliberate curation to bury the truth under a mountain of engineered positivity. So if you're looking back at these colonial archives, aren't we basically looking at a historical, state-sponsored PR campaign designed to cover up a systemic atrocity?
The PR analogy is helpful, but I would actually argue the archival photography was much more insidious than corporate damage control.
Really? How so?
Because a PR firm is trying to distract you from a known truth. The residential school photography was designed to completely replace the truth.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. These photos were contrived propaganda used to secure ongoing government funding and to convince the public, and even the parents of these children, that the assimilation process was a healthy, civilizing success.
How did they actually engineer that lie through the lens, though? Like, what were the physical mechanics of staging these photos?
McCracken points out some fascinating and really devastating details. Look at the sports uniforms, for example.
What about them?
They were intentionally oversized.
Oversized. Why?
This exaggerated the boys' masculinity and made their bodies appear much larger and more robust than they actually were. It was a visual trick to mask the reality of malnourishment.
That is incredibly manipulative.
It is.
Yeah.
And the standardized poses, the neat rows, the identical short haircuts, this wasn't just about showing off a sports team. It was a visual demonstration to the public that indigenous cultural identity had been successfully stripped away and replaced with disciplined, Eurocentric uniformity.
It's visual proof of concept for the state's assimilation policy. Look how civilized and healthy they are.
Exactly.
But we know now definitively that was a complete fabrication, because when you contrast those smiling, muscular photos with the reality documented by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, the disconnect is just horrifying.
The contrast is staggering. While the archive showed healthy athletes, the TRC documented massive overcrowding, severe chronic malnourishment, rampant disease outbreaks like tuberculosis, and just systemic physical and sexual abuse.
And the data on the missing children is just, it's really hard to even speak about. The Liddy Library data gives us the numbers.
The numbers are grim.
Very. The TRC originally estimated that around 3,200 children died in these schools.
Right.
But as more ground-penetrating radar is used and more records are slowly unsealed, that number has continually risen to over 4,100.
It keeps climbing.
It does. And Murray Sinclair, the former chair of the TRC, has stated the true number of missing and deceased children could be as high as 6,000.
6,000 children who were taken from their homes and simply vanished from the official record.
And we have specific, documented examples of how the state treated these children even in death. Take the Dunbow Industrial School in High River, Alberta.
That case is heartbreaking.
We know of at least 73 children who died there.
Yeah.
And in 1996, there was a massive flood of the Highwood River.
Yeah.
The floodwaters eroded the bank and literally exposed the caskets and the remains of these children. It took until 2001 to properly identify just 34 of them and rebury them.
It's horrific.
Or look at the Regina Indian Industrial School, where 38 unmarked graves were identified using radar. The reality was mass graves, not hockey teams.
And, the violence of the system did not end when a child survived and eventually returned to their community.
No.
The structural violence was designed to have a long tail. This is where the research by Jean Lafrance and Don Collins provides crucial context on how the social fabric of the family was unraveled for generations.
Let me see if I have the mechanics of this right. Are they arguing that the trauma is passed down genetically? Like, the stress alters the DNA of the survivors?
No, it is not a biological transmission. It is a sociological and behavioral disruption.
Okay, clarify that.
Lafrance and Collins document how children were extracted from their homes from the ages of 3 all the way to 16.
3 years old.
Yes. And they were separated from their families for 10 months out of the year.
So they spent basically their entire formative childhood in an institution.
Exactly. Now, think about how a human being actually learns to be a parent.
I mean, you just kind of pick it up, right?
Well, it isn't instinctual. It is learned behavior. You learn how to parent by being parented.
Right. Okay.
You learn by observing how your mother or father handles stress, how they show affection, how they negotiate conflict, and how they comfort you.
That makes sense.
But these children were raised in environments dictated by rigid schedules, bells, and brutal corporal punishment.
So when they finally aged out of the system and returned home, they didn't just lose their language. They lost the blueprint for how a family functions.
They were systematically denied the opportunity to experience parental love or healthy role modeling.
Wow.
Lafrance and Collins synthesized how this created a devastating break in the intergenerational transmission of parenting skills.
Because they never saw it modeled.
Right. When these survivors eventually had their own children, they simply lacked the vocabulary and the behavioral repertoire to show affection. Some survivors have spoken openly about not knowing how to physically hug their own children because they had never received a hug themselves.
That is just deeply, deeply tragic.
It is. And in the darkest cases, because the only model of authority they had ever known was the physical abuse they suffered at the hands of school officials, they equated discipline with violence.
Oh, I see.
This resulted in a self-perpetuating cycle of trauma. The state didn't just break the family in the present moment. They dismantled the psychological mechanism for family building in the future.
Okay, when you look at that kind of systemic engineered disruption, you have to wonder how those same legal mechanisms operate today.
Exactly. We have to look at the present.
Because it's so tempting to look at 1998 as the end of an era. The schools are closed, so the state intervention is over, right?
That's the myth.
But the underlying utilization of structural violence to disrupt families hasn't disappeared. It has just evolved. Which brings us to the contemporary United States immigration system.
It is a really critical through line. We are moving from colonial religious schools in Canada to modern borders and legal statuses in the U.S., but the underlying sociological principle is strikingly similar.
The state deciding who gets to be a family.
Yes, the state is still using its power to dictate which families are allowed to remain whole and which are subjected to instability.
And this introduces a fascinating concept from Dr. Newman's lectures, drawing heavily on research by Enriquez. It's the concept of multigenerational punishment.
Yes.
Specifically, Enriquez applies this to what sociologists call 1.5 generation young adults.
Well, let's define that. The 1.5 generation refers to individuals who were either born in the United States or brought over at a very young age.
Okay.
This means they are fully documented, they are citizens, or they hold legal permanent residency.
So they have papers.
They have all the legal rights on paper. However, their parents are undocumented.
I'm struggling a bit with the terminology here. If the young adult is a legal citizen and they have all their papers, how are they being punished by the state?
That's the paradox.
The law isn't targeting them, it's targeting the parent who broke the immigration law, right?
That is exactly the friction Enriquez is highlighting. Multigenerational punishment occurs when legal sanctions intended for a specific targeted population, the undocumented parents, spill over and severely restrict the lives of family members who are legally exempt from those sanctions.
Spillover.
The documented citizen is not the target of the law, but they suffer the punishment of the law by proxy. Their legal status does not protect them from the reality of their family's vulnerability.
Okay, so this brings us right back to the difference between structural and symbolic violence. Let's break down how that actually looks in the day-to-day life of a 1.5 generation young adult.
Yeah. Structural violence in this context is the literal execution of the law. If an undocumented parent is pulled over, arrested, and physically deported by immigration enforcement, the family experiences structural violence.
Right.
The state has actively intervened to remove a family member, leaving the documented child behind, often with immense financial and emotional burden.
But the symbolic violence is the part that dictates their entire reality, even if nobody ever gets deported. Symbolic violence is the omnipresent shadow of the law. It's the fear that dictates behavior.
The constant fear.
Enrique documented the specific coping strategies these families use, which they call impression management.
Yes. Impression management is the constant, exhausting curation of your public behavior to avoid any interaction with the state.
Let's put the listener in those shoes for a second. Imagine your own home. Imagine your living room.
Okay.
Now imagine that somewhere in that room, there is an invisible tripwire. You can't see it, but you know it's there. And if anyone in your family accidentally trips it, the state will detonate your entire life.
That's exactly what it feels like.
Now apply that to leaving the house. If you are a 1.5 generation young adult and your undocumented parent is driving you to the grocery store, you aren't just listening to the radio.
No.
You are hyper-vigilant. You are constantly checking the rear-view mirror for police cruisers. You memorize which neighborhoods have higher police presence. You ensure every single taillight is functioning perfectly because a broken piece of plastic could mean your dad is gone forever.
The psychological toll of that invisible tripwire is immense. You are a legal citizen of the country, yet you are forced to internalize the anxieties and the hypervigilance of a fugitive.
Wow. A fugitive.
Yeah. Families avoid taking vacations because crossing a state line or encountering a random checkpoint is too risky. They might avoid seeking medical care or attending school functions out of fear of exposing their parents.
Just staying completely under the radar?
The state doesn't have to physically deport anyone to control the family. The mere threat of it fundamentally restricts their freedom.
And what makes this so destabilizing is that the rules of the game are constantly shifting depending on the political winds.
Very true.
And, I want to be really clear here for you listening. We are not taking political sides on this. We are just looking objectively at the data across different administrations.
We are just reporting the policy mechanisms.
Exactly. We see a shift in the mechanism of immigration enforcement, but the underlying disruption to the family remains. For example, under the Trump administration, we saw the implementation of Title 42. This utilized the COVID-19 pandemic as a public health rationale to immediately return migrants at the border, effectively freezing the asylum process and leading to well-documented physical separations of families in holding facilities.
Then, transitioning to the Biden administration, the stated policy goal was to create a more orderly, humane process and reduce the chaotic optics of physical separation at the border wall.
The optics changed.
The mechanism shifted to a highly bureaucratic, tech-forward approach.
Right. They introduced smartphone apps and web portals where migrants have to schedule an asylum appointment before they even approach the border.
But if we look closely at how this operates sociologically, the structural violence against the family unit hasn't vanished. It has just been digitized and bureaucratized.
Just a different tool.
If a family crosses outside of that specific app-based system, perhaps because they lack a smartphone, reliable internet, or are fleeing immediate danger, they are heavily penalized.
How does that penalty actually work in practice? They aren't throwing the kids in separate cages anymore, so what is the state doing?
They use intense surveillance and impossible deadlines. Families who cross outside the system are placed under strict curfews.
Curfews.
Yes. Adult family members are often fitted with GPS ankle monitors, and the state enforces an incredibly tight 30-day window.
30 days to do what?
Within those 30 days, the designated head of household must navigate a labyrinthine legal system in a language they likely don't speak to prove their legal eligibility for asylum.
And if they can't afford a high-priced immigration lawyer to navigate that maze in 30 days,
Then the entire family faces expedited deportation. The threat of separation is still the primary tool of enforcement.
unbelievable.
And consider the economic impact of this. How do you build a stable life, secure employment, or invest in your children's education if you are wearing a GPS monitor and know your entire existence in the country could be terminated in a month?
You can't. You are economically paralyzed.
Precisely. The state is utilizing legal instability to ensure economic and social marginalization. The family is kept in a perpetual state of survival, unable to build social capital.
Which brings us to a massive question. We've talked about the state extracting children from indigenous families to kill a culture. We've talked about the state using the threat of deportation to keep immigrant families in a state of perpetual terror and economic paralysis.
The themes repeat.
They really do.
Yeah.
So what is the ideological root of all this? What gives a state the arrogance to believe it has the right to intervene so violently in the family structures of specific groups of people?
To understand the justification, we really have to look back at the ideological bedrock of North American social policy,
Which is?
the Eugenics Movement. This was a pseudoscience that gained massive mainstream popularity in the United States and Canada during the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Just to be clear, when we say pseudoscience, we mean it had absolutely no basis in actual biology, right?
None whatsoever.
It was basically taking plain, old-fashioned racism and slapping a lab coat on it to make it look official.
Exactly. The core tenet of eugenics was the false categorization of human beings into biologically, intellectually, and morally inferior and superior groups based on race and class.
And who was at the top?
The dominant group-white Euro-Christian society positioned itself at the absolute pinnacle of human evolution.
And this was incredibly convenient for the state, wasn't it? Because if you have a scientific consensus that certain groups of people are biologically inferior, suddenly you have a moral justification for colonization.
It provided the perfect rationale. If you classify the indigenous inhabitants of a land as racially inferior, primitive, or savage, then invading their territories, extracting their resources, and dismantling their societies is no longer viewed as a violent crime.
It's framed as helpful.
Under eugenic logic, it is framed as the natural order of things, or even a noble, civilizing duty.
And the echoes of that logic are still driving global policy today. Dr. Newman draws a really sharp modern parallel to the ongoing exploitation of the Democratic Republic of Congo.
That's a great example.
The DRC is massively rich in minerals like cobalt, which is, essential for powering our cell phones, laptops, and electric vehicles. Yet the local population experiences horrific violence, forced labor, and extreme poverty.
It's devastating.
Why? Because outside powers and multinational corporations are operating on that exact same neo-colonial logic, extracting immense wealth while completely devaluing the lives and family structures of the people who live on top of it.
The mechanism of resource extraction relies entirely on the ideological devaluation of the local population.
Yeah.
If you view them as less than human, their suffering is simply an acceptable business expense.
Right.
And culturally, this eugenic ideology led directly to the violent enforcement of assimilation we discussed earlier.
And you can see how deeply this ideology permeated the culture when you look at the media we consume. Think about the language that was normalized. I mean, look at a classic Disney movie like Pocahontas.
Yeah, that's a wild one to rewatch.
Yeah. It's an animated children's movie, but the entire central conflict is built around the colonizers casually singing songs calling the indigenous people savages.
The use of that specific terminology is not accidental. Savage is eugenics adjacent language. It is a tool designed specifically to dehumanize.
Because if you can convince the general public that a group of people are savages, you completely delegitimize their humanity.
You don't have to respect them.
You don't need to respect their family structures because in the eyes of the state, they aren't real families anyway. They are incapable of proper child rearing. That is the exact horrific logic that justified putting 150,000 kids into residential schools.
And this raises a deeply uncomfortable question for modern society. Has that eugenic logic actually disappeared, or has it just learned to hide behind new bureaucratic language?
Based on the sociological data and recent investigative reporting, the answer is pretty clearly no.
It hasn't disappeared.
The assumption that marginalized parents are inherently unfit has just evolved into new forms of structural violence. And the most glaring, heartbreaking modern example of this is the birth alert system in Canada.
This is where we see the direct descendant of the Indian agent standing at the door of the reserve translated into modern hospital policy.
We relied heavily on a phenomenal CBC investigative report to understand the mechanics of this, and I warn you, this is really difficult to hear.
It's tough material.
What is a birth alert, mechanically? It is essentially a flag or notification issued by a provincial child welfare agency directly to hospitals.
Okay.
The agency decides, without needing a court order, that a pregnant person is high risk. This alert legally requires the hospital staff to contact the state the moment that person arrives to deliver their baby.
Think about the legal implications of that. Is the state preemptively deciding that a parent is a threat to their unborn child, often before any actual parenting has taken place?
They just assume it.
And they bypass standard due process. It is a legal assumption of guilt applied at the moment of birth.
I want to use an analogy here. It's almost like the movie Minority Report, where the police arrest you for a crime they predict you might commit in the future.
Pre-crime.
It's pre-crime, but for parenting. And the data shows overwhelmingly that the targets of these alerts are Indigenous, racialized, and disabled parents. The CBC report detailed the stories of 3 women who faced this system, and notably, all 3 were themselves survivors of the 60s scoop.
The 60s scoop being a previous era of mass Indigenous child removal.
Exactly. Their stories highlight how the eugenic assumption of incompetence operates in practice.
Let's talk about those specific cases.
Take Kathleen Rogers. In 2010, she gave birth in a hospital in Winnipeg. 3 days after giving birth, while she was sitting in her hospital room actively breastfeeding her newborn son, social workers accompanied by security guards walked into the room and literally took her baby off her breast.
Awful.
They detained him for 3 months. Why? Rogers later discovered through her files that the workers had stereotyped her. She stated they basically looked at her and assumed she was a drunken Indian.
Just a horrific stereotype.
There was no proof of substance abuse, no proof of harm, just a racist assumption that triggered a massive traumatic state intervention.
The mechanism there relies entirely on a demographic profile. The state looked at her race and class and deemed her biologically or culturally unfit without requiring any actual evidence.
Then we have Nietzsche Dupuis. She was threatened with a birth alert and the seizure of her newborn simply because she used medical cannabis to manage a degenerative disc disease prior to her pregnancy.
They're a medical condition.
Yes. A nurse literally walked into her room and told her, "Children's Aid Society will be standing at the door and they will take your baby." The symbolic violence of that threat is unimaginable.
And to see the long-term impact of this structural violence, we look at Audrey Redman. Her experience goes back to 1972.
What happened there?
Her newborn son was taken from her for 10 days. The agency took him while she frantically searched for housing that met their arbitrary, constantly shifting standards.
And the trauma of those 10 days didn't just vanish when she got him back, did it?
No. 50 years later, that son still suffers from lifelong separation anxiety. The disruption of the family bond at that critical, vulnerable moment leaves permanent scars.
This system of birth alerts was only officially banned in most Canadian provinces within the last few years, mostly between 2019 and 2021, and only after massive public outcry and investigative journalism.
It took that long.
But the fact that it operated so openly for decades proves that the eugenic logic of the state deciding who is allowed to build a family is still deeply embedded in our institutions.
So we've spent a lot of time talking about how the state uses its power to aggressively intervene in separate families. But there's another side to this coin.
What's the other side?
State violence isn't just about what the state actively does to marginalized families. It's also about what the state actively fails to do.
That is a crucial sociological concept, the violence of omission. If the state views certain populations through a lens of historical eugenics and systemic racism, viewing them as less valuable, it will inherently invest fewer resources in their safety and survival.
And this devaluation is starkly, horrifyingly evident in the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, or MMIW.
We really need to touch on this.
The statistics surrounding MMIW represent a profound failure of the state in both the United States and Canada. We are talking about thousands of Indigenous women, girls, and men who vanish, with the average age of the victims being just 29.
And the response from the state is so often a bureaucratic shrug. But I want to understand the why here. Why is it so easy for these cases to fall through the cracks? The outline mentions jurisdictional nightmares. What does that actually mean on the ground?
The legal landscape on reservation land in the United States is incredibly complex due to the history of tribal sovereignty and federal law.
It's a patchwork.
Exactly. If a violent crime occurs on a reservation, the local or municipal police outside the reservation often lack the legal jurisdiction to investigate. The burden falls to tribal police forces, which are historically massively underfunded and under-resourced by the federal government.
So they literally don't have the manpower. Who steps in?
Theoretically, federal agencies like the FBI hold jurisdiction for major crimes. But the reality is that the FBI is often slow to respond to individual missing persons reports on reservations. This creates a massive investigative black hole.
A black hole.
Furthermore, when families attempt to report a missing person to whatever authority will listen, the authorities routinely, almost reflexively, dismiss the early reports as runaways.
Which completely squanders the crucial first 48 hours of an investigation where evidence is fresh.
Exactly. The assumption is that the disappearance is a personal failure or a behavioral issue of the victim, rather than a potential crime that demands state resources.
The disparity in how the state and the media value lives is just staggering when you look at comparisons. Think back to 2021 in the Gabby Petito case.
Oh, that's a very clear contrast.
A young, white, blonde influencer goes missing while traveling. It triggers a massive wall-to-wall international media frenzy. News helicopters are in the air. Multiple state and federal agencies coordinate a massive manhunt. The entire country practically stopped to look for her.
It was everywhere.
But when an Indigenous woman goes missing under similar circumstances, it barely makes the back page of the local paper.
The contrast perfectly illustrates the sociological concept of missing white woman syndrome. It is a textbook example of whose lives are deemed worthy of state resources, police protection, and public grief, and whose lives are treated as disposable.
And this systemic devaluation extends to Indigenous men as well. Look at the tragic case of Colbrings Plenty in early 2024.
That case got so little attention.
He was a 27-year-old Indigenous actor. He was featured on a Yellowstone spinoff, and he was a student at Haskell Indian Nations University in Kansas. He goes missing. Days later, he is found dead in a wooded area.
It's just an awful situation.
And crucially, his hair, which holds profound sacred cultural significance in his community and represents his connection to his family and ancestors, had been cut.
And despite those deeply concerning circumstances, the initial response from local authorities was to release statements suggesting no foul play was suspected.
His family and the broader Indigenous community had to organize, protest, and literally beg for a thorough investigation. The state's default setting when encountering violence against marginalized bodies is minimization and dismissal.
They look the other way.
They fail to protect the family unit by failing to seek justice when it is shattered.
And, the systemic devaluation doesn't just apply to physical safety. It extends deeply into the economy, which in turn dictates family stability. If we want to understand how families survive, we have to look at the structural violence of economic stagnation.
Let's expand on this because it's a huge piece of the puzzle. We are looking at a historical period stretching roughly from the 1850s all the way through the globalization boom of the 1980s.
A huge chunk of time.
Throughout that massive stretch of time, North America actively imported foreign-born populations to perform essential grueling labor.
We were talking about the physical building of the nations. Chinese immigrants brought in to blast through mountains and build the Transcontinental Railroad in the 19th century.
Dangerous, back-breaking work.
Massive influxes of migrant agricultural labor to feed the continent. The expansion of manufacturing labor during the 1980s globalization push. The state and multinational corporations possessed an insatiable demand for their bodies and their physical labor.
But here's the paradox that the sociological data reveals. Despite this massive, continuous increase in the immigrant population over a century and a half, their total share of the nation's wealth has remained staggeringly flat.
It hasn't moved.
Why? If they are doing the work, why isn't the wealth building?
Because the system was structurally designed to extract their labor while legally denying them the pathways to economic mobility.
I see.
Historically, you see mechanisms like the Chinese Exclusion Act or laws that explicitly prevented Asian immigrants from owning property. If you cannot own land and you are denied a clear path to citizenship, you cannot build generational family wealth.
You are legally trapped in a permanent underclass.
Precisely. The structural violence ensures that your labor enriches the dominant culture while your own family remains economically paralyzed.
So, if you are a marginalized group trapped in that kind of economic stagnation, how do you survive? How do you attempt to protect your family or achieve any kind of stability when the laws are stacked against you?
This brings us back to the concept of assimilation, but viewed through an economic lens. One survival strategy, both historically and presently, is exogamy, which is commonly referred to as outmarriage.
Okay, let's break down the mechanics of exogamy.
Exogamy is when a member of a marginalized minority group marries outside their ethnic background, frequently marrying into a group that holds white or honorary white status within the society.
Okay, marrying up, so to speak.
Sociologically, this can operate as a conscious or subconscious strategy for safety, economic stability, or social mobility.
Yeah.
If the state denies you economic power based on your race, marrying into the dominant race provides a proxy shield of privilege and access to resources that would otherwise be blocked.
I see what you're saying, but that feels very, like, clinical. People marry for love, right? It's not just a strategic financial merger.
Of course, people marry for love. But sociology asks us to examine the environment in which that love occurs.
Right.
Even love and attraction are heavily influenced and often polluted by colonial, racial, and gendered stereotypes. The structural hierarchies dictate who is considered a desirable partner.
How does that actually manifest in the data, though? Give me an example.
We see it clearly in how different genders within the same racial group are treated by the dominant culture. For example, look at the historical and ongoing treatment of Asian populations.
What does the data show there?
There is a deep colonial history of exoticizing and hypersexualizing Asian women. The dominant culture frames them through subservient stereotypes, which manifests in everything from mainstream media representation to the darker realities of the mail-order bride industry.
Which is incredibly exploitative.
It's an industry entirely driven by leveraging economic disparity in developing nations for the benefit of men in wealthier nations.
So Asian women are fetishized as desirable commodities by the dominant culture. What about Asian men?
Conversely, Western culture has historically marginalized and desexualized Asian men. They were historically portrayed as laborers, not romantic leads.
Wow, the contrast is stark.
So the state and its cultural apparatus actively dictate the perceived value of bodies. This heavily influences rates of outmarriage, which in turn reshapes the demographics and the social fabric of the marginalized communities themselves. The state's economic and cultural violence dictates the intimate reality of the family.
Okay, we have covered an immense, really heavy amount of ground today, and we need to synthesize this deep dive for you listening.
Let's tie it all together.
What is the overarching narrative we've uncovered? We started with the physical, literal theft of Indigenous children in the residential school system, masked by smiling, contrived archival photographs.
Right.
We moved to the modern bureaucratic theft of newborns in hospital rooms via the birth alert system. We explored the multi-generational legal punishment that forces documented immigrant citizens to live with an invisible tripwire in their living rooms.
It's all connected.
And we traced all of this back to a foundational eugenic ideology that devalues marginalized lives, whether that manifests as the state shrugging off missing Indigenous women or legally trapping migrant labor in economic stagnation.
The sociological through line is undeniable. Whether through physical extraction, bureaucratic surveillance, or economic exclusion, the state has consistently utilized both structural and symbolic violence to intervene in the family unit.
The state keeps finding a way in.
The goal has always been to enforce dominant cultural norms and maintain control.
It is a really heavy realization. It changes how you look at the news, how you look at the law, and how you look at the concept of home. But we do not want to leave this analysis solely in a place of despair.
We need to talk about resistance.
Because where there is power used for harm, there is also the power of resistance. I want to return to McCracken's work on the residential school photography to end on a note of empowerment.
Yes. McCracken highlights remember the Children Photo Identification Project at the Xinhuac Residential School Center? This project is a perfect example of reclaiming the archive for healing.
How does the project actually work?
The original archive was built by the colonizer, the photographer, to erase the individual identity of the children and project a lie of assimilation.
Right, the PR campaign.
But the Xinhuac project takes those very same propaganda photos and brings them back directly into the indigenous communities. They sit down with survivors, with elders, and with families, and they do the painstaking emotional work of putting real names to the anonymous faces in those photographs.
They're literally taking the pen out of the state's hand. They are writing their personal truths, their actual lived histories, and their stolen identities back into the official records.
Exactly. Reclaiming the historical record is not just an academic exercise. It is a vital, non-negotiable first step in community healing.
It restores their humanity.
You cannot dismantle structural violence without first reclaiming the truth of who was subjected to it and restoring their humanity in the historical record.
It is about taking that master key back from the state. And that brings us to our final thought for you to mull over today. We started by talking about the illusion of the family sanctuary.
The lock on the door.
We've seen how history proves that the archives, the photographs, and the official records of the state are incredibly curated. They are designed by those in power to hide systemic abuse and project a false image of benevolence.
The archive is never neutral.
So I want you to think about your own life right now. Think about the massive data trail you are leaving behind every single day. If historians 100 years from now decide to look at our generation, if they pull your digital footprints, your health app data, your medical files, your location tracking, your immigration status, your tax records, what story will the state's algorithm tell about you?
It's a scary thought.
Will those future historians be able to see the actual truth of who your family was, the specific struggles you faced, and the love you shared? Or, just like the children hidden behind those smiling residential school photographs, will someone a century from now have to fight desperately to reclaim your true story from the archive?
It's a profound question about power, memory, and who ultimately gets to write the history of the family.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into Adam's curriculum. It's been a heavy journey, but an absolute vital one to understanding the world we live in. Keep questioning the archives, keep looking out for the tripwires, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.